Hello and welcome to the Folklore Podcast Book Club. I'm Mark Norman, folklore author and researcher, and the creator and host of the Folklore Podcast. On today's episode of the book club, I speak to Dr. Sharon Blackie about her book Foxfire, Wolfskin, and Other Stories of Shape-Shifting Women. So first, Sharon, welcome onto the Folklore Podcast Book Club. It's lovely to have you here.
And it's lovely to be here. Thanks so much for inviting me.
Oh, it's an absolute pleasure. So today we are talking about your book, Foxfire, Wolfskin. But before we do that, just tell everybody a little bit about who you are and what you do for those that are not so familiar with your work at the moment.
Yeah, well, I've got a lot of ologies, I'm afraid. I originally trained as a psychologist, and I consider myself mostly a mythologist with a specialist in Celtic studies, I suppose. And that's where my interest in folklore comes in, because when I did my master's degrees in Celtic studies, my dissertation was very much on the folklore specifically of the catalogue, the old woman of Gaelic and Gallic folklore who created and shaped the land. And most of my writing, my work these days would be on that kind of melange of psychology, possibly in the Jungian, kind of post-Jungian context, and mythology with a bit of ecology thrown in. So it's very much about how folklore and fairy tales and myth connects us back to a sense of belonging to our places, to the land. That would really be the heart of both fiction and non-fiction for me.
And that's also why, isn't it, I guess we find that the Jungian approach crops up so much in both, well, actually fiction and especially obviously non-fiction folklore work, is that idea of belonging and that sense of being part of something kind of ties in with the idea of the collective folk memory and why we get that feeling, doesn't it? So I'm not surprised to hear you say that.
Yeah, it does. I mean, the only thing about some of the traditional Jungian work, which is based on Jung's early ideas, is that it tends to be very focused in our own heads. It's very human-centric. Whereas if you look at Jung in his later life and some of the post-Jungian work, it's very much more about trying to get us out of our heads and into the land again, and into the stories of the land, and connect up a little bit more so that it's not too human. And that's really my passion, I suppose, for that kind of approach.
Yeah, which is exactly where this book goes, isn't it? So tell us a little bit about the premise of this book. I mean, it's obvious from the title, Other Stories of Shape-Shifting Women being the kind of subtitle from what I said earlier, that it is obviously a book of women's stories sat within folk tales, and a very empowering and a very positive treatment of that as well. So tell us a little bit about how this came together.
Well, I guess really, I've always loved fairy tale reimaginings or retellings, starting with the wonderful work of the inimitable Angela Carter and her ilk, when they really first started to take off in the last century. But it seemed to me that although a lot of fairy tales had been retold, or folk tales had been retold from a feminist perspective, very few of them had moved into the kind of environmental crisis age, and hadn't really combined them. And I don't see so much of that happening. So given that I am clearly, as someone who studied folklore, a great believer in the importance of these stories continuing to have relevance over the years and over the centuries, continuing to grow, to shift and to shape shift and to transform themselves, it just interested me to think, okay, how would, if those stories were told today to have relevance for the problems and issues we're facing today, how would they look? And specifically, what would those women's voices sound like? What would they have to say to us? So it really began from that whole question that I was asking myself. And then, of course, as you well know, Celtic myth and fairy tale particularly is so full of shape-shifting, particularly in women, that it just seemed like an obvious place to start, and that in that attempt to get us out of our heads and back into the world again.
And there's a very broad mix of tales here as well, isn't there? I mean, there are some very well-known ones. So you've got the Scottish story, just flicking through, of the water horse, the Yaga, which is a very well-known story, for example. And you've got the premise of the witch turning into a hare, which is very, very common within our own folklore.
But there's a range of stories across a range of countries in here as well, and some that are not so well known. What are some of the less well-known stories that you've given a new treatment to in this collection?
Well, I think there's a beautiful, for example, there's a beautiful old Irish, I guess it's somewhere between myth and romance, really, the Madness of Mish, which is about a woman who basically goes mad because of the traumas of battle. She sees a battle and her father killed. She goes mad. She grows feathers and wings and flies off into the mountains and is rescued by not by some great hero, but by a very gentle man who plays his harp and offers her all kinds of things that are much finer for her, and kind of brings her back to life that way. So that story has always really appealed to me, and it's a very powerful story that's not very well known. So I was trying to really find, it wasn't so much that I was looking for stories that were well known or less well known, it was really that I was looking for the powerful women's voices in the stories wherever they were. All of the stories were European, or I guess the Baba Yaga story, kind of Eastern European, because I don't feel comfortable stepping outside of my own culture and owning those stories. And a couple of the stories were my own creations. So the Bogman's Wife, for example, which is about a trout which shapeshifts into a woman. I guess there are stories about that. I've never actually found very many of them, but that, because I lived in the Isle of Lewis in the Outer Hebrides for a long period of time, with all of those waterways filled with little trout, it just kind of captured my imagination and sprung up organically from the land. So yeah, Wolfskin, from the title, is a Croatian story, which is kind of like a Croatian version of the Scottish Selkie story of the seal woman who loses her skin. But in Croatia, it's about a wolf woman whose skin is stolen, not a seal woman. So a lot of the tropes, a lot of the motifs are the same, as we always find in folklore, don't we? But it's just that the actual clothing that the stories wear are a little bit different from place to place.
Yes, it's an example, isn't it, of how folk tales travel around and remain the same in essence, but they take on that cultural kind of appropriation, I guess, of what people find around them. So it would be natural in Croatia, where seals are not 10 a penny, let's be honest, right, to take on what is a much more common animal in the wolf, and of course within folklore and folk tale, wolf skins come up in various different ways anyway. So it's an interesting look at how these stories kind of change and develop from place to place, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And, there are two stories in there about old women. So one about the catalogue, the old woman of Irish and Scottish Isle of Manx tradition, who created and shaped the land, and Baba Yaga from the Russian tradition, where you could argue that, from a Jungian perspective, they're the same archetype. They're the slightly dangerous old woman of the world who doesn't really want to be messed with, but they're, very different iterations in both of those countries and very different flavors of the personality and the characteristics around them. And I love that. I love that variety in the stories as well.
And I do like the variety as well of the ways that you've reinterpreted these stories, and the Baba Yaga story, I guess, is a prime example of that, where you do feel within the first couple of pages like you're suddenly reading the literary equivalent of The Only Way is Russia. It becomes very much a kind of celebrity culture story. Tell us a little bit about that one, because it is thoroughly entertaining, the Baba Yaga story.
Yeah, that's a bit of a wicked story, and I'll probably have rotten tomatoes thrown at me if I ever find my way to Totnes as a result of that story.
I do live about an hour away from Totnes, just
so you know.
Okay. Yeah.
I know Devon very well, but not Totnes. I couldn't resist it. That story was a really weird one. I don't know where that came from. I didn't really intend to write it. It just arrived. I just sat down one morning. I was thinking about Baba Yaga. And again, if Baba Yaga came to us today, what would she have to say about the mess that we're in? And so it's a bit of a It's a bit of a satire on, I guess, the worst atrocities of the New Age movement, I suppose, in that she is a very earthy woman, clearly, who lives in the middle of a wood, and there is a slightly less earthy woman who goes to her to learn what she thinks is to engage with her power animal in a shamanic sense, whereas actually Baba Yaga wants to turn her into a deer. Into a real kind of like proper shape-shifting animal. And I think, to me, it comes back again. All of these stories came from, I didn't just want to change the plot of them, do you know? So it wasn't about reimagining always the endings or the narrative. It was about reimagining the voices of the women, literally. And so that's why I think they're so different, because the women in these stories are so different. So Baba Yaga is having none of what she sees as this New Age nonsense. She wants people to show up and to do the work, and that's kind of why she puts the young woman from Totnes through such a hard time.
And there's another very very well-known female from folklore within here as well, isn't there? And that's the Snow Queen, who everybody will know from Hans Christian Andersen, or from the ideas within the Narnia stories, which adopt the Snow Queen character as well. How have you treated the role of the Snow Queen within your version?
Well, that story sprang from the fact that I always thought the Snow Queen had a bit of a bad rap, because if you go back to the original Hans Christian Andersen story, she's not presented as evil. She's presented as elemental. She is winter, she has no spite. She takes the little boy, she looks after him in her wintry way. She is described as going out into the world to bring the necessary winter to the vineyards and to the growing things, so that everything gets a chance to rest. So when the kind of likes of Disney and all of these kind of books and movies started to present the Snow Queen or Snow Queen analogues as a baddie, it really offended me, because she is a necessary part of the seasons and cycles of the world. So I always felt a bit sorry for that had happened. And given that I said at the beginning that what this book was about was trying to imagine or reimagine these stories for an age of environmental crisis, I just wondered, what would, if global warming is the problem, does the Snow Queen become a heroine in her own very wintry way? And so that was the spurt for that. Maybe she's the one who saves us in the end.
So let's just consider for a little bit that role of women within folk tales. You touched there upon the fact that the Snow Queen starts off, at the very least, neutral in Andersen's story, certainly not some kind of malevolent force or some kind of threat, but then changes. And in a lot of folk tales, we find the role of the woman in this way, don't we? The evil stepmother, or somebody that's either being persecuted or is persecuting. Very rarely, I guess, compared to the amount of hero stories, do we find those heroine stories. Why do you think that is?
Well, I'm not entirely sure I agree, to be honest. I think what's happened, and this is just my personal perspective, I'm not suggesting that I'm right, it's just kind of maybe my focus is going looking for the heroine stories, so I find them by default. But I think actually it's possibly just that they've been given less attention. But, particularly Scotland, Ireland, and parts of England are full of feisty heroines who save the hero. You've got Kate Crackernuts, or who save their sisters or whatever. Everything from Kate Crackernuts to the East of the Sun and West of the Moon, the Black Bull of Nodaway, where they save their husbands, even if they've been partly responsible for getting them into the mess in the first place, And I think often we forget how many of those stories there are. And in those stories, often the heroine is very different from the hero in that the helpers and the natural world always seem to be a really profoundly intrinsic part of her overcoming whatever problem she is facing. So it's almost always done with animal helpers, or with a mother who's turned into a tree after she's died or something like that. And I find them very, very connecting. And perhaps in a sense that reflects the old mythology of Britain and Ireland and the other Celtic lands, where, women were so very much associated with the land, kind of personifying the land in a way, and shape-shifting into animals. And that, in a sense, is carried down, I think, into the folklore. So I find these stories fascinating, and they're everywhere. But the ones that have been more popular, and the ones certainly that the likes of Disney have filmed, have been the ones where you have these kind of, these pretty little heroines who aren't very useful for very much, who do what they wanted good women to do in the times, which is, do what the men say and be quiet most of the time and wait to be rescued. And there's so much more than that. Life was so much more interesting than that. But the wicked stepmother, it's just worth pointing out that, again, as you're well aware, these fairy tales reflect the problems of the times. And there would have been many deaths of mothers in childbirth in the times when these fairy stories were first beginning to be written down, even let alone in the oral tradition before then, where, a stepmother, a younger stepmother with a child of her own perhaps would have come into a family, and maybe there would have been a squabble for very meager resources. So I think at some level, it's not just prejudice against women. I think it does actually reflect some of the unfortunate social issues around at the time.
Yes, absolutely. And it kind of reflects that struggle for power, even if that power is within an individual household, doesn't it?
Yes, it does, exactly.
Do you find, from the research that you've done to both write these stories and around this subject, which I know is one that you're particularly interested in, that it is predominantly women that feature in shape-shifting stories? Yeah. Why do you think that is?
Well, certainly in kind of the Celtic tradition, if I can use that word, it is true. I don't know. I wouldn't consider myself enough of an expert in other, folklore from other parts of Europe or the Slavic countries to say that. But in Celtic tradition, yes, it is. And that is just simply because in the very oldest stories, the stories that we might think of as myths because they are about deities and rather than the lives of kind of the folk, we do find that seamless transition from humanoid to animal form as a natural part of their way of being in the world. So, this was not a cosmology, this was not a spiritual tradition in which the humanoid form was the only one that was seen to be important. Our ancestors believed that there was a wisdom in animals which we as humans were not privileged to, and which sometimes we needed. So, you've got, for example, that wonderful old Welsh story of the oldest animals. I know it's a motif that occurs in other places as well, where, when King Arthur is out looking for Mabon, son of Modron, and he's looking for a clue to find him and his knights or his band of warriors at that time. They go to the oldest people in the village. The oldest people in the village don't know. They go to the older people in the next village. They don't know. They send them to the animals. The animals send them to the older animals, and the older animals, till eventually they end up with the oldest animal. And the oldest animal is the one that knows it. So that sense that there is a wisdom in animals that we would do well to respect, because it's different from ours, it's a different way of perceiving the world, I think is inherent in the oldest stories that we have, and probably then traveled down for that way into the folklore and the fairy tales, and it just became one of those things. It's like, yeah, some days you're a human, some days you're an animal.
We should probably mention the other story from your title, out of fairness as well. So we touched upon Wolfskin and the Croatian story behind that. Tell us what the story is for Foxfire, which is the other one that you've chosen to put in your title.
Yeah, well, that was not really, although it's based on a character, the Huldra, in the Nordic tradition. That wasn't actually based on a particular story. That was my story, if you like. So that was more fiction rather than a reimagining. And again, it was that sense of, which I've certainly had of just wanting desperately at certain stages in my life, actually quite a lot of stages of my life, I think, to know what it would be to be a fox, to know what it would be to be an animal, a real sense of identification, of love for an animal like that. And I think a lot of women, possibly men too, I've never looked at it so much, and then feel that sense of identification that is so close that it becomes like a love. And that sense of the animal and the foxness drawing her out of a period of stasis, a period of mourning, a period of grief, by kind of putting her back in touch with her, what you might think of as her animal self. So that sense of animals, again, as having something that we need to, showing us the way, helping us, just as they do in all the best fairy tales, but in a very, very specific way here, was kind of the motivation for that. But the thing about that, the thing about a lot of these stories as well, which is just one point I wanted to make, is what I love about some of these old stories is the very oldest stories is they have consequences. So again, in a lot of the more modern retellings, it's just like they're very unsatisfying. Even the Selkie story is very unsatisfying. This guy's stolen her skin and kept her captive for 7 years, and off she walks into the sea, and he gets to live his life. That seems to be very unsatisfying sometimes. Whereas in the oldest stories, in the oldest, the ones that we might think of as myths, if you mess up, there are consequences. If you don't keep the balance between humans and the land becomes a wasteland, or there's an inundation, there's a flood. If you mess up once too often, then something happens. And so I also wanted to reinstate in some of these stories, not a kind of unpleasantness, but just a sense of there are consequences to our actions if we don't treat the world and people and animals in it well.
Well, that's one very important point from within folktales and within folklore more generally, I suppose, isn't it? Is that it is a teaching aid. Whether that's the Victorians teaching morality through their stories, or whether it's these older stories with the consequences for the land and those sorts of things. It is, one of the best forms of teaching, isn't it? The art of storytelling. Yeah, so
absolutely. And I think that what's interesting now is we're kind of circling around a little bit. So some of the older stories which teach us about how to live in balance and harmony with the land and how not to take too much are the very stories that we need again right now. And I look back at some of the old Irish stories, like the story of the Glass Gavelin, the cow of plenty, basically, and who's milked into a sieve. Everybody's allowed to take a bucket of her milk. I'm sure most of your listeners will know this story, but everybody's allowed to take a bucket of her milk until one day a woman comes along with a sieve and many buckets, so that it doesn't appear as if, because the sieve is empty all the time, it doesn't appear as if the buckets are ever full. And once the Glass Gavelin, the cow of plenty, cottons onto what's happening, off she flies and is never seen again in the world. And there is no more milk. And those old stories, although they seem very simplistic, I think there's a really profound, because of the way that they present themselves and the potency of the imagery and the simplicity of the story, there's a very profound teaching there that can kind of sink into you, lodge into you, and stay with you. And that, to me, is the power of folk and fairy tales, the beauty of it and the simplicity of those images.
Absolutely, and it's really, really well represented as well within this book, which is the wonderful thing about it. I just want to, before we finish, touch on one other thing, which is that it is also a beautifully presented book, and I just want to give you the opportunity to mention the illustration for this book as well, because aside from the cover, which people saw at the beginning of this video, which is very beautiful, my copy from the publisher came with beautiful little postcards in like this, which are representations of some of the illustrations which head up the stories in the book. How did those come about?
Well, I always love, because fairy tales particularly are so image full, it just seemed to me that these really did warrant someone taking an imaginative approach to trying to illustrate them, as all the best fairy tale. I've got collections of old fairy tale books and folklore books that have got the most beautiful illustrations in, and they help you retain the story. They enhance the message of the words. And it was my publisher who found Helen Nicholson, who is the young artist who created these created these drawings. And yeah, they're just unique. Some of them are just completely unexpected, and yet they all represent some essence of the story in a very, very perfect way. So I was really absolutely delighted to have her illustrations as part of it, and in the paperback cover as well, to have it incorporated by the designer into the paperback cover. Their animals are beautiful.
Yes, they really are. It's a lovely way of illustrating them. So if people want to see that to full effect, then they should get a copy of the book, obviously. If they want to learn more about yourself and your writing, do you have a web presence that you'd like to direct people to?
Yes, I do. People can go to my website, which is just sharonblackie.net, and there's lots of resources on my books on there, including readers group kind of questions and guides and what have you, and various other resources on folklore and fairy tales as well.
And can they purchase from you directly?
No, I don't sell my own books, but there's a link to my publisher's website. So if they prefer to buy from lovely independent publishers who produce beautiful books, then they can do that by following the link on the website too. But they're available everywhere, of course.
Absolutely, absolutely. And as an ebook?
And as an ebook, yeah, Kindle, yes. and other ebook formats too. Yeah.
Perfect. So Foxfire Wolfskin is published by September Publishing. There's a link to their website via Sharon's. If you wish to also do so, we would always suggest that you support your independent bookshop. If you are close to one, they'll also be able to order you a copy in. If you prefer e-reading, then you have options for that too. Do seek out a copy and enjoy it as much as I did. Sharon, thank you so much for coming on and talking about this lovely book.
Thanks, Mark. It was a great pleasure.
I hope you enjoyed today's episode of the Book Club. You'll find links in the description below to visit Sharon's website and the September Publishing website to get yourselves a copy of Sharon's book. There are also links there to the Folklore Podcast website, where you can find other book reviews and resources, as well as links to the whole back catalogue of the main podcast, and ways to help to support us to keep this show going and free and accessible to everybody. Thanks for watching, and I look forward to seeing you again on the next episode.